Imagine how children's boots, once dangling cutely on a boy's feet, became the mark of a mad tyrant. That was the nickname given to Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, one of the most controversial rulers of the Roman Empire. In the year 37 AD, after the death of Tiberius, a 24-year-old young man ascended the throne. His first meeting with the people coincided with jubilation in the streets, as the old emperor had ended his reign in paranoia and seclusion on the island of Capri, where he was accused of brutally murdering his relatives. The young ruler, nicknamed Caligula in childhood because his tiny feet resembled the military sandals of legionaries, initially lived up to expectations. He freed political prisoners, distributed generous allowances to the townspeople, and organized grand horse races with gladiatorial combats to distract the people from the economic hardships that had followed the civil wars. Experts criticized him for his extravagance and spending on the construction of a huge temple of victory and a temporary bridge across the Gulf of Naples, but ordinary people saw him as a benefactor. Soon, strange behavior began to emerge. Caligula ordered the Senate to award his favorite horse, the honorary title of consul, flew into hysterics over trifles, claimed that he could grant and take life with a single glance, and indulged in cruel massacres in the imperial hunting grounds. Political opponents disappeared without a trace, and the Praetorian Guard, called upon to protect the emperor, learned that only they had the right to take his life. When the young emperor declared war on a sea god and sent troops to collect shells as trophies, it became clear that his military talent had been drowned in madness. Historians blame the sudden change in character on a severe fever that struck the emperor shortly after his accession, as if darkness had awakened in his consciousness, saved from death. Under threat of execution, the Senate demanded honors and titles. Court intrigues went beyond the bounds of decency, and an alliance with the head of the Praetorian Guard, Severus, strengthened the tyrant's sole power. As a result, 4 merciless years turned into mass executions of aristocrats, the plundering of the treasury, and the moral decline of the upper Senate. Having enslaved the people through fear and unrest, Caligula was assassinated by conspirators in the 41st year of his reign, after which the Senate condemned his memory, forbade mention of the tyrant's name, and ordered the destruction of all his statues. But the lesson remained forever. Nothing prevents a person with a childish nickname from becoming the executioner of his people if society trusts the will of one man. If you enjoy such detailed historical stories, subscribe to the channel. It's free and will help me continue. How does a monster grow up? Imagine a child whose mind has been fed on fear and blood from an early age. Caligula was born in the 12th year after the birth of Christ into a family that had become a symbol of Roman power. His father, Germanicus, was a popular figure, a celebrated military leader, the grandson of Augustus himself, and the nephew of Emperor Tiberius. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a direct descendant of the first emperor and instilled in her children a sense of the exclusivity of their family from an early age. Their house was famous for its extensive estates and luxurious villas on the Palatine Hill, and their alliance with prominent senators seemed unbreakable. But their isolation from the court made the family vulnerable to court intrigues. When the boy turned 2, Germanicus took his family to the German border, believing that surrounded by soldiers, he would absorb pride in the greatness of Rome. The decrepit legionaries, exhausted by the swamps of Germany, raised the tiny Germanicus in miniature armor, gave him toy shields, and named him the mascot of their unit. At night, the moans of the wounded could be heard in the tents, and the child's mind was forever filled with a mixture of lullabies and the cries of the dying. By the age of 7, Germanicus died in Antioch, and Agrippina was convinced that the poisoner was Tiberius himself, who feared his son-in-law's growing fame. She instilled in her children the idea that anyone in the palace could stab them in the back. the fearful Tiberius accused her and her 2 older sons of conspiracy. Agrippina died of starvation in exile, and her brothers were either executed or committed suicide. Only little Caligula survived, along with his 2 sisters, spending many years in strict confinement on the island of Pandateria, where there was neither bread nor sunshine. This psychological torture in his youth killed his ability to love, but developed his gift for impeccable hypocrisy. Having mastered the art of disguise at an early age, he understood that in order to survive, one must be tougher than any threat and more ruthless than those one fears. If you enjoy these calm stories about history, please subscribe to the channel. It's free and helps me continue. Who would have thought that on the day of the reclusive Tiberius' death, the capital would explode with the noise of flowers and a river of wine? For more than 20 years, Tiberius, grandson of the first Emperor Augustus, was immersed in intrigue and mistrust, especially after his departure to the island of Capri, where he withdrew from the administration of the city and tightened the laws. So when, in the year 35 AD, he officially adopted the young Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus as his heir, the Romans breathed a sigh of relief. They were tired of the dark era of austerity and fear. Germanicus, a renowned military leader who died of poisoning under mysterious circumstances, left behind a legendary reputation, and his son, nicknamed Caligula for his childhood soldier's sandals, inherited not only his generosity, but also his charm with the masses. On March 18, 37 AD, he finally came to power after the death of Tiberius. Some called it the natural course of events. Others whispered about a pillow placed there by the ruthless hand of ambition. Soon, the details of the affair were forgotten and gave way to noisy celebrations. Wine flowed through the streets, petals rained from people's mouths, and rows of sacrificial animals were impressive in their scale. In every neighborhood, free gladiator fights were held, even with wild animals from distant provinces, and chariots raced day and night as if under a spell. Caligula abolished his father's harsh sentences, freed political prisoners, and gave each free citizen 400 coins, which was equivalent to 4 months' salary for ordinary work. The senators were surprised by such generosity, but for the common people, it was a real gift from fate. New buildings sprang up in the streets, from aqueducts to theaters and circuses, with craftsmen working tirelessly, and the roads littered with scaffolding and wagons loaded with marble, accompanied by the sound of hammers and the creaking of wheel axles. However, it was this unbridled extravagance that proved to be the first warning sign. Behind the glitz of golden dishes and rivers of wine lay a passion for excessive pomp, too rapid and uncontrolled to be simply a desire to please the people, and it heralded the looming darkness of power. Have you ever imagined a horseman galloping across the waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea? This is not fiction, but a true story. At the very beginning of his reign, Emperor Caligula ordered the construction of a 5-kilometer pontoon bridge from the resort town of Baiae to the port of Pozzuoli, just so that he could ride back and forth across it on horseback for 2 days in a row. He relied on a prophecy that he had as much chance of becoming ruler as he did of walking on water, and decided to literally fulfill this prediction. The cost of construction was estimated at millions of Roman coins, which was equivalent to the budget of several provinces. But the senators and the people saw it as a wasteful joke in memory of the late Tiberius, and as a mad desire to surpass him. The initial enthusiasm for the grandiose project of the Julio-Claudian dynasty quickly gave way to anxiety, but the real turning point came in October of the 37th year, when Caligula fell seriously ill and lay unconscious for almost a week with a high fever and delirium. Doctors had no doubt that the state would lose its ruler, and his subjects prayed for a miracle. After he awoke, the people rejoiced as if he had risen from the dead, not noticing that something irreversible had happened in his mind between sleep and reality. Already in December of that year, when the city was filled with the aromas of roasted chestnuts and hot wine before the celebration of Saturnalia, courtiers noticed the disappearance of slaves and executions on trumped-up charges, for sneezing during the emperor's speech or for wearing the wrong shade of toga. Rome, once renowned for its grandeur, suddenly plunged from peaceful celebration into silent horror, because the ruler did not limit himself to secret executions. He turned his power into a theatrical spectacle of madness, culminating in a decree appointing his horse Incitatus as consul. The beautiful steed lived in a marble palace, fed on selected barley, drank water from gilded bowls, was washed with oil, and had its mane braided with silk. Senators who had dedicated their lives to serving the Republic were forced to seek the horse's blessing when discussing laws, which finally undermined confidence in the ruler. This trait was the last straw. Conspirators from influential families devised a deadly plan that soon ended the emperor's life and opened a new chapter in the history of Rome. This is a story about power that turned into a mad nightmare. The senators of ancient Rome, many of whom had drafted laws under Augustus and tactfully made concessions to Tiberius, found themselves in a position where they had to humbly ask a horse for permission at a meeting. Emperor Caligula, Augustus' third successor, in the 37th year of his reign, granted the horse Incitatus the title of senator, built a marble stable for him, and ordered that he be fed from a golden trough. But that was only the beginning. Caligula proclaimed himself not just the ruler of the empire, but a god, and in all seriousness ordered that statues of himself be placed in the temples of Rome, replacing the heads of Jupiter and Minerva with his own image. An even more grandiose plan was to expand the palace. He built, in his own words, a divine bridge from his bedroom on the Palatine Hill directly into the inner chambers of the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, so that he could engage in conversations with the gods at any time. In this unprecedented self-satisfaction, even the priests, accustomed to the whims of rulers, shuddered with horror. Every morning, crowds of citizens lined up at the palace windows. They kissed the emperor's sandals, sacrificed animals, bowed down, and recited that Caligula was almighty and above all gods, and anyone who refused disappeared without a trace. The most disturbing episode was the destruction of the family of a prosperous merchant, whom the emperor happened to meet in the marketplace. Wishing to test whether a man could bear the loss of his dearest ones, Caligula ordered without mercy. He called her his only wife in the empty marble corridors and erected monuments in her honor. But behind this love lay an abyss of madness. Caligula was only 2 years older than Drusilla and spent his childhood with her, poisoned by fear after the mysterious death of their parents and the systematic destruction of their family by their despotic uncle Tiberius. In this closed world of behind-the-scenes intrigues, where they were raised as heirs to exclusive rights and taught that ordinary laws did not apply to them, their brotherly and sisterly affection grew into something more. Historians Suetonius and Dion Cassius noted that the emperor maintained close relationships with all 3 of his sisters, Drusilla, Agrippina, the younger, and Livia. But only with Drusilla did he share his bed and power. In the evenings, when the palace corridors were lit by flickering torches and the Praetorian Guard patrolled the clearly marked boundaries, Caligula and Drusilla would meet in the imperial chambers, living as husband and wife, and they did not hide. At lavish banquets, she took the place of the honored spouse, ate the same food and drank wine from the same cup, and he called her my wife in front of senators and ambassadors. Imagine an Egyptian or Gallic ambassador returning with a report on negotiations with the ruler of the enlightened world, who had witnessed a ritual of incest. Even the most hardened Romans were shocked. To finally confirm his decision, the emperor presented Drusilla with precious jewelry worth more than the annual budgets of individual provinces, erected temples for her, and minted coins bearing her image and the title of Augusta, previously reserved only for his lawful wife. In public speeches, he called his sister the only person who understood me after the death of all the others, my soul and comrade in arms. And Drusilla reciprocated. She softened his anger, advised him on political decisions, and together with him wove a web of revenge against those who dared to question Caligula's divine right. Their union became not just a family taboo, but a tool of state power, leaving an unhealed wound in the memory of Rome and becoming a reason for eternal condemnation. Did the emperor declare war on his own grief? Historians described how Drusilla, Caligula's younger sister, influenced his decisions and calmed him in his fits of rage, as if there was a world of their own between them, beyond the laws of Rome and the morals of those around them. Together, they made plans for cruel revenge, shared the trauma of their early childhood, and a thirst for absolute power that soon turned into a dangerous addiction. One soul in two faces, fueling madness. In the 38th year after the birth of Christ, Drusilla fell seriously ill, and the emperor did not leave her bedside. The best doctors were brought to Rome. He made generous sacrifices to the gods and vowed to arrange mass offerings if his sister recovered. When Drusilla died, Caligula declared mourning throughout the empire, forbade celebrations, theaters, and any signs of merriment, and threatened immediate death to anyone caught smiling. Rome was plunged into oppressive silence. People whispered, bowing their heads in fear of the emperor's wrath. But his contemporaries were even more shocked by his subsequent treatment of reality. In honor of Drusilla, he proclaimed her a goddess of Olympus, ordered temples to be built, annual celebrations to be established, and a special council of priests dedicated solely to her cult. Every night, according to eyewitnesses, he came to his sister's statue as if to a living companion, reported to her on the decisions of the Senate, consulted her on matters of state, and swore that one day they would be reunited among the gods. Thus, an empire with no fewer than 50 million subjects found itself in the hands of a man whose decisions were based on the whispers of marble. The madness only grew stronger. Around the year 39 AD, Caligula formally declared war on the endless waves of the sea, ordering his legionaries to enter the water and pierce the surf with their spears, and to collect shells as trophies in sign of victory. However, the real climax came in the 40th year after the birth of Christ, when he decided to strengthen his reputation as a great conqueror and led 8 legions, about 200,000 men, against Britain, that distant island land that had caused even Julius Caesar no end of trouble. Thousands of carts loaded with food, weapons, and tents set off along the stone roads of Gaul. Peasants and craftsmen dismounted and hid in their homes at the sound of the marching troops, while the legionaries secretly dreamed of returning to the Eternal City with gold and Celtic prisoners, so that their names would be sung in all the taverns of the empire. A naval battle with the air? Could the emperor declare war on the ocean itself? Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known to posterity as Caligula, had long dreamed of a grand campaign in Britain and trophies that would immortalize Rome. The soldiers imagined returning with British gold, captured Celts, and stories that would be told in taverns. A few days before landing, the emperor held lavish sacrifices to Mars and Neptune in Rome and secured their blessing. However, in the 3rd year of his reign, when the troops reached the shores of the strait at Boulogne-sur-Mer, an unexpected display of willfulness on the part of the leader occurred. He climbed onto the bow of the moored ships, gazed intently at the raging waves, and turning to his stunned generals proclaimed that Neptune, god of the seas, dared to challenge his authority. The emperor declared that today he would prove who was master here, and ordered the legions to be formed not against the barbarians, but against the elements themselves. Imagine Roman discipline. About 200,000 warriors in shining armor, under hundreds of banners, lined up in perfect order, and before them, instead of an enemy army, the boundless ocean. Caligula, sitting on his horse in golden armor, proclaimed, "Soldiers of Rome, let us destroy the enemy who has never been defeated. Neither land nor sea nor heaven can withstand our valor." Thus began one of the most absurd but surprisingly well-organized operations. The legionaries rushed toward the surf, plunged their swords into the water, threw their spears into the foam, showered Neptune with mockery, and collected shells, seaweed, and sea urchins as spoils. The emperor surveyed the battle and ordered his troops not to leave a single enemy shell behind. A few hours later, Caligula solemnly declared total victory and ordered his men to fill sacks with their spoils as proof of the complete submission of the god of the seas. He then sent an official report to the Senate with a detailed account of the defeat of the elements and the capture of their riches. Ancient historians, including Suetonius and Cassius Dio, condemned this incident as an extreme example of imperial eccentricity and a symbol of the undermining of the legion's morale, which further outraged the aristocracy. The soldiers left the shore with a sense of bitterness and humiliation, and less than a year later, this incident became one of the reasons for the conspiracy that ended with the assassination of Caligula. Thus, this naval campaign remained forever in the annals as an example of the ruler's self-confidence, taken to the point of absurdity, and his desire for divine worship where there could be no dispute, an incredible absurdity. One of the craziest Roman emperors declared war on the sea itself. In a letter preserved in the imperial archives and quoted by Suetonius, Caligula described in detail how he subdued the rebellious waters and seized the treasures of the underwater kingdom. He ordered the shells and seaweed to be delivered on triumphal chariots guarded by entire legions, as if they were the empire's most precious treasures. The inhabitants of Rome stood frozen, staring at the caravans laden with peeling shells and sour seaweed, while the soldiers, exhausted by their commander's madness, looked on with undisguised shame. But even more depressing was the reaction of the upper nobility. Senators, not daring to contradict the unlimited power, held lavish celebrations on the occasion of the greatest naval victory in history, invited singers and priests, and at court composed hymns in honor of how Caligula humiliated Neptune himself. 200,000 veterans who had fought on the frontiers and saved the capital more than once remained silent on his orders and merely carried out absurd orders. Because in an empire where madness was combined with absolute power, common sense was considered an impermissible luxury. The cost of this war exceeded the annual expenditure of several provinces, seriously depleted the treasury, and worsened supplies to the garrisons in Gaul and Spain. If you think that the rain of shells was the height of his madness, know that it was only a solemn prologue. Then something much more cruel and systematic began. The games in the Colosseum suddenly ceased to be entertainment and turned into cruel experiments on people. Like a deadly addiction to spectacular road accidents from which modern people cannot tear their eyes away, Caligula made the suffering of his neighbors state policy. He staged performances in which respected citizens, merchants, craftsmen, and even junior senators suddenly became gladiators. Without training or proper protection, they were driven into the arena against experienced fighters and watched as ordinary people face death. The appearance of a merchant was instantly replaced by shouts from the stands, where the emperor, like a ruthless puppeteer, demanded, "Let him be broken!" Mock shops, street decorations, and false temples were all transformed into a stage for a bloody spectacle. A holy scribe was forced to recite poems, defending them with his words and his life, while a simple baker saw the value of his craft depend on the amount of blood he spilled. Cruelty became a form of art, and Rome became a theater where the god of cruelty ruled. Imagine how, in the greatest empire on the planet, one man declared the air his property and proclaimed a tax he had invented to be an unalterable tribute. In the 40th year after the birth of Christ, Rome turned into something that even the darkest poet would not dare to call hell on earth. Emperor Caligula was still busily building his own temples and shrines, convinced that he was creating a new art form that would be glorified by future generations, and did not consider himself a psychopath, but rather an innovator ahead of his time. Even earlier, after the first 8 months of his reign, the treasury was empty. Generous funding for gladiatorial games, the distribution of bread and entertainment to the crowds at the circus, expensive gifts to senators and the army eager to serve a generous ruler. All this instantly depleted the state treasury, leaving Rome on the verge of bankruptcy. When just over 3 years had passed since his accession to the throne, the economic crisis reached its peak. Even the most conservative advisors acknowledged that the city had fallen out of its financial orbit. Instead of taking measured steps, Caligula introduced ruthless taxes, half the value of any real estate, a third of income from commercial transactions, a quarter of inheritances, and even a so-called breathing tax mandatory for anyone who dared to breathe within the city limits. Residents who had lived for centuries under the protection of law and stability felt like characters in a nightmare. Cherished family estates were transferred to the state overnight. The poor sought shelter in slums and cemeteries, hiding their last coins and jewels in secret chambers. But when the absurdity became too much, the emperor established imperial auctions. Random wealthy citizens were forced to buy non-existent items from him, whether childhood memories or a gladiator's dreams, for fabulous sums, sometimes up to 500,000 coins for a crescent moon or a bohemian bowl. Any complaint was considered treason against the state and was punishable by death. Financiers and merchants resorted to desperate measures. They hid their savings in deep crypts, transferred their estates to front men, and sometimes even faked their own deaths to escape the emperor's oppression. Rome turned into a city where the rich pretended to be poor, and the poor died of hunger. But behind this was not a rapid depletion of the budget, but a demonstration of omnipotence. Caligula did not need money for projects. It was important for him to prove that he was capable of destroying family wealth with a single stroke of the pen for his own entertainment. And the most terrible detail symbolized his complete break with reality. Once he fined a senator for unauthorized breathing in the forum, declaring it a violation of order, which was the final proof of his madness when power over life and death became a bizarre game with no rules and no winners. When gold became a condiment rather than currency, the world of Rome finally collapsed. The dazzling splendor of imperial banquets deceptively concealed the ruin in which the great city was sinking. While ordinary people were barely holding back their despair from hunger, Caligula built golden pyramids. He confiscated gold coins, ground them into dust, and sprinkled this extravagant seasoning on dishes, not for taste, but to literally devour all the wealth of the empire. Grain stopped arriving on time from Egypt and Africa due to crop failures and bandit raids on key trade routes. Provinces were emptied, and the tragedy of famine remained in memory only where coins still jingled. Letters poured into the capital from all corners of the empire. There was no more money or grain, and it was impossible to collect taxes. These lines were tinged with panic, capable of shaking even the most solid authority. The emperor responded harshly and imperiously. If there is no money left, sell your children. If you cannot find young ones, sell your estates. When they too are gone, put the heir itself up for auction. Dangerous conversations began in the Praetorian camps. Veterans who had served under the 4 previous rulers wondered if they had doomed Rome by obeying insane orders. Centurion Cassius Chaereas wrote in his diary, "We swore to defend Rome, but what can we do when Rome needs protection from its own ruler?" This question quietly pulsated in taverns and narrow streets. In Britain and Gaul, individual legions were already questioning their oath to the emperor and calling for the restoration of the Senate, which had fallen silent only for a moment to discuss secret amendments to the government that could halt the rapid collapse. Caligula himself remained convinced that he was creating a new great era, forgetting the needs of the common people, but history had long been preparing an answer to such illusions. In January of the year 41 AD, Rome was filled with cold fear and a sense of impending doom. In the corridors of the imperial palace, whispers turned into glances, and those who had laughed carefree yesterday behind the pyramids now listened to the ominous echoes behind closed doors. Something was brewing in the shadows, and for the first time in 4 years, it was no longer within Caligula's power. Cassius Chaereas felt that the limit had been reached and that only one last push was needed to take decisive action. What could be more humiliating than this morning's scene? It seemed that no noble rank could protect them from the tyrant's mockery. Cassius Chaereas was a veteran of the Praetorian Guard, a man who had seen the death of emperors and the birth of new dynasties, who had lived through political purges and bloody battles, but he had come face to face with something he could not bear: daily humiliation while defending a ruler who was destroying everything he had once sworn to protect. Back in the year 13 AD, he joined the guard created by Augustus to protect his heirs, and over the decades became a model of military honor and loyalty to the Roman state. But under Caligula, who had suffered a serious illness and turned into a cruel and capricious tyrant, honor in the eyes of the emperor was reduced to a farce. Every dawn, Cassius cautiously approached the throne room to utter the insulting word "Priapulus" through the snickers of the guards, which had become a symbol of his deepest resentment. It was as if all his battles and achievements had been erased by a single malicious sneer from his master. He was not alone. In the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, he was supported by Cornelius Gabinius, who had lost his brother in one of Caligula's theatrical executions, and Marcus Vinius Valens, whose family had been ruined by new taxes and confiscations introduced by the emperor for the sake of luxurious entertainment. These were not adventurers or conspirators seeking personal gain, but loyal soldiers who had come to the unanimous conclusion that their ruler had become a threat to the very existence of the empire. At first, they cautiously joked about the tired tyrant and ridiculed the idea of eternal vacation. But soon the conversation turned to discussing the removal of the ruler, which required not only courage, but also extreme caution. Caligula changed his routes through the palace corridors, tightened security, and surrounded himself with loyal henchmen, and murder did not solve the question of the legitimacy of his power. Then the conspirators turned their attention to Claudius, the emperor's uncle, whom everyone considered a weak, stuttering schemer, and therefore unacceptable in high politics, which is precisely why he had survived the dynastic purges. Ironically, the most harmless-looking man turned out to be the one who could become a bridge to a stable transfer of power, preserve order, and prevent the empire from descending into the chaos of civil war. Who would have thought that a stuttering bookworm would survive the ruthless dynastic strife? Claudius survived family purges because no one considered him a real rival. His slurred speech, timid physique, and habit of spending hours in the library studying past emperors created the illusion of complete apoliticality. But he watched closely and memorized every movement in the palace corridors. This attention to detail worked in his favor when the conspirators, fearing direct exposure, engaged him in cautious, academic conversations about forms of government and historical examples of power transitions. Claudius skillfully feigned simplicity, understanding what was being discussed, but remained silent until he was convinced of the seriousness of their intentions. The conspiracy was not born in a fit of anger. For months, Caligula's habits were carefully studied. His unpredictable fits of rage, his hostility toward the Senate, and the vulnerability of his guards when he refused to be accompanied at his own request. They recruited disgruntled officers. Imagine how the torch-lit night corridor is filled with the dull clang of weapons. The emperor's usual stroll to the games turned into an explosion of blood and a sharp turn in the fate of Rome. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known as Caligula, was heading to the arena accompanied by his most loyal Praetorian commanders, Maxidius Sabinus and Caligula. On the surface, everything was going according to plan. He was excitedly discussing the upcoming battles, one hand adjusting the hem of his cloak, the other resting casually on the hilt of his sword. But his fingers were white with tension, and his gaze betrayed his hidden anxiety. During his 4 years of rule, which began in the year 37, he had managed to earn a reputation as an indomitable tyrant. Grateful applause was replaced by the uneasy silence of senators and courtiers, and sudden executions and ostentatious mockery inspired chilling terror. Around March 15, 41, they descended into a narrow underground passage on the slope of the Palatine Hill, dimly lit by torches. The marble walls reflected flickering glints, and the rustling of footsteps drowned out the roar of the crowd in the arena. At the most inopportune moment, Caligula froze, as if he had heard a strange noise behind him. His paranoia-trained intuition kicked in instantly, and he turned around. His gaze met that of Cassius Quinctius, the emperor he had once loved, but now full of cold determination. The same determination that had been seen many times in the eyes of doomed senators. No sooner had he uttered a word than Sabinus drew his sword with lightning speed. The first blow pierced his shoulder, cutting through bone and muscle, and Caligula cried out not from pain, but from shock. What happens to a man who has no limits, no "no" in his vocabulary? Historians have tried to understand this by describing Caligula's madness. Subsequent authors, primarily Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus and Publius Cornelius Tacitus, were unable to find words to describe the 4 years of systematic terrorism that turned Rome into a giant trap of fear. They worked for